Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to immerse ourselves in a single 24-hour period, December 4th, 2025.
And this was a day that really felt like a collision of worlds.
It really was. In Washington, you had these incredibly high-stakes international deals being brokered. At the exact same time, though, the city was witnessing these unprecedented clashes over the very foundations of U.S. governance.
It's a fascinating duality. You have this aggressive, outward-facing pursuit of strategic goals.
Right.
And it's set against this backdrop of profound domestic instability. It was a day where the signal and the noise were equally loud.
That's a great way to put it. I mean, if you just glanced at the headlines, you'd see a dozen different crises: conflicts, climate events, economic shifts.
And that's our mission today. We've compiled 15 dense global reports and notes on everything from, critical mineral supply chains to Supreme Court maneuvers.
Our goal is to extract the key nuggets for you.
Exactly. We need to go beyond just what happened and really try to understand the structural why behind it all. Why were these things, peace deals, power struggles, climate disasters, all peaking at the exact same moment?
Precisely. So if you need a shortcut to being thoroughly informed about this really pivotal moment in late 2025, you are in the right place. We're going to connect the dots.
We're going to draw a line from the targeted killing of a militia leader in Gaza all the way to a legal fight over a building in D.C.
And trace the path from deadly floods in Asia right back to U.S. policy rollbacks on electric vehicles.
And fittingly, we're starting today in Washington, D.C. with a diplomatic triumph that, when you look a little closer, really reveals the hardening strategic conflicts it was actually designed to address.
Okay, so let's start with what was supposed to be the diplomatic centerpiece of the day, the Washington Accords.
Right.
On December 4th, you have the leaders of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo President Kagame and President Tshisekedi signing this U.S. brokered deal.
And the stated goal is huge. It's meant to end 3 decades of just devastating conflict in eastern Congo.
30 years. It's almost hard to comprehend.
It is. This is a massive long-term stability issue. The deal is supposed to finally wind down the fighting that involves the M23 rebel group.
Which is allegedly backed by Rwanda.
Allegedly backed by Rwanda, yes. And dozens of other armed militias that are operating in the DRC. The conflict has cost millions of lives and displaced millions more. It's a humanitarian catastrophe.
So what were the specific commitments? I mean, what did Washington manage to get these two traditionally antagonistic nations to agree to on paper?
Well, the deal follows a framework that the U.S. had brokered earlier in mid-2025. And it requires very clear reciprocal action. It's a two-way street.
Okay.
So on the DRC side, the big commitment is to move decisively to neutralize the FDLR.
And remind us who the FDLR are.
The Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda. They're a Hutu militia group that's directly linked to the 1994 Rwandan genocide, and they've been operating out of eastern Congo ever since. This has always been Rwanda's #1 security concern.
So in exchange for Congo dealing with them, Rwanda has to do what?
In exchange, Rwanda pledges to withdraw its own forces and, crucially, permanently halt all support, logistical, financial, whatever, for armed groups like M23 operating across the border in the eastern DRC.
Okay, so that's the security framework. But this is where it gets really dense and strategic, because this isn't just a humanitarian peace deal, is it?
Not at all. It's an economic blueprint. And
Yeah.
it's directly tied to the global competition over supply chains.
That's the real story here.
That is the absolute strategic core of this deal. Yes, it promotes things like cross-border trade corridors, but the real pressure point is critical minerals.
Cobalt, lithium.
Exactly. The agreement guarantees preferential access for U.S. and allied firms to the vast mineral wealth of the DRC. We're talking cobalt, lithium, and other rare earths. These are the foundational components for all modern clean energy tech, for EV batteries, for advanced defense systems.
And why is getting that access in the DRC so critically important for Washington right now?
Because the DRC is just a colossal player. It holds the world's largest reserves of cobalt. Right now, it supplies something like 70% of the global total.
70%, wow.
But, and this is the key, the supply chain is deeply polarized. The mining happens in Congo, yes, but the vast majority of the refining and processing capacity is controlled by China.
So China essentially has a chokehold on the whole manufacturing pipeline for batteries and EVs.
A complete chokehold. So the Trump administration is leveraging this peace deal to try and bypass that Chinese dominance, or at the very least, to secure a direct U.S.-friendly source of the raw material. It's about adding resilience to the Western supply chain and reducing that geopolitical risk.
So they're touting this as a diplomatic and an economic victory, all in one stroke.
That's the messaging, absolutely.
It sounds, on paper, like a geopolitical masterstroke. You're linking regional peace to global economic dominance. But what about the people on the ground? The ones who suffered for 3 decades? The sources mention a lot of skepticism.
The skepticism is intense, and for good reason. You have prominent human rights advocates, including Nobel laureate Denis Mukwege, warning that this accord risks becoming just another example of, well, of prioritizing Western mining and strategic interests over true justice for Congolese civilians.
So the argument is that stability can't just be bought by facilitating resource extraction.
Exactly. Mukwege and others are arguing very forcefully that lasting peace requires genuine accountability for decades of war crimes.
Which means prosecuting perpetrators.
Prosecuting the perpetrators, many of whom are tied to the very militias these leaders are now promising to neutralize. And it means ensuring that local communities, not just political and business elites, actually participate in and benefit from the process.
So the fear is that this is just an elite bargain struck abroad.
That's the phrase, yes. That it might just rearrange who gets to profit from the minerals, rather than fundamentally changing the structure of violence and impunity that has plagued the region for so long.
What's the test then? What are observers watching for to see if this is real?
It's really twofold. First, will we actually see Rwanda withdraw its forces, and will Congo commit to genuine security sector reform? That's the security test.
And the second?
The second is whether the promised economic benefits actually flow down to ordinary people, or if they're just captured by a narrow ruling elite. And we have to remember, even as the leaders were shaking hands in D.C., M23 fighters were reportedly still controlling key territory. Clashes were still happening.
The peace is still very fragile.
Extremely. The entire mechanism of peace here is fundamentally economic, and that creates this intense pressure for transparency, which has historically been lacking.
A perfect example of global strategic competition imposing itself on a local conflict. Okay, let's shift continents now. We're moving from a very complicated peace in Africa to the escalating brutal war in Europe.
Right, to Ukraine.
And here, the story is a brutal winter strategy, stalled diplomacy, and some profoundly hardened rhetoric.
Russia's focus going into the deep winter of 2025 is, it's unmistakable. They are targeting energy infrastructure.
The same strategy we've seen before.
It is, but it's renewed. On and around December 4th, we saw these missile and drone barrages specifically hitting Ukraine's power grid. Reports came in of badly damaged power and heating infrastructure, especially in the southern regions.
So this is a deliberate tactic.
Oh, absolutely. It's a deliberate, highly destructive tactic aimed at leveraging the cold itself as a weapon. You leave hundreds of thousands of civilians facing outages just as temperatures are dropping well below freezing. The goal is to maximize misery, to sap civilian morale, and to test the resolve of Kiev and its Western backers.
And all of this is happening while there's still diplomatic maneuvering going on in the background. We know the U.S. had been quietly circulating a peace proposal. What did that look like?
The U.S. proposal was aimed at achieving a de facto ceasefire. The idea was to freeze the current front lines.
Not recognizing them as borders, though.
No, absolutely not recognizing them as international borders, but freezing the fighting. And then focusing on securing large-scale prisoner exchanges, which is a major priority for both sides. The hope was just to stabilize the military situation long enough for some kind of comprehensive negotiation to happen later.
And what was the reaction from Vladimir Putin to this American attempt?
Well, Putin, speaking at the Reuters Next T conference, he acknowledged the proposal. He said he'd seen it, but he stated that Russia could not accept certain elements of the plan.
He didn't say which ones.
He didn't detail which ones, no. But crucially, he insisted that while Russia was open to constructive talks, they would only proceed strictly on Russia's own terms.
Which suggests a pretty fundamental incompatibility.
It does. It suggests a negotiating stance that is just not compatible with the principles that Ukraine and its allies have put forward. It's soft language that's masking a very, very hard reality.
And when you put those comments next to other things he said that week, that diplomatic facade seems to just crumble entirely.
That's the critical contradiction the sources really highlight. While he's talking about constructive talks, he's simultaneously delivering this deeply provocative message during his high-profile visit to India.
What did he say there?
Speaking to Indian media, he unambiguously stated that Russia was prepared to take the Donbas region by force.
By force. That is not the language of compromise.
It is a maximalist statement. It completely contradicts any signal about freezing the front lines, and it just raises the stakes for any future peace plan.
Hmm.
It confirms Russia's commitment to achieving its territorial goals, regardless of diplomatic pressure.
And you can see how European public opinion is processing this hardening rhetoric. The anxiety must be enormous.
It's measurable. There was a major survey released that week. It spanned Germany, France, and 7 other European nations, and it found that a majority of respondents in key countries, like Germany and France, reported seeing a high risk of war with Russia.
A high risk of war with Russia themselves.
Yes, for their own countries.
Yeah.
This isn't just background noise. It reflects this intense public anxiety that the conflict could spill over their borders. And that anxiety directly influences their domestic politics. It boosts pressure on governments to increase defense spending, to secure energy supplies, and to maintain or even accelerate military support for Kyiv.
The sense of security in Europe has been profoundly shaken.
Profoundly.
The global tension is just so thick. Let's shift now to the Middle East, where the war in Gaza also entered a new, grim phase. It was marked by internal conflict and this continued diplomatic paralysis.
The really significant strategic development on December 4th was the targeted killing of Yasser Abu Shabab.
And who was he?
He was the leader of the so-called tribal forces, sometimes called the tribal brigades, in Gaza City. And his death represents a major setback for a core component of Israel's post-Hamas governance strategy.
Can you define these tribal forces for us? It sounds like they were central to Israel's long-term plan there.
They were. The tribal forces were made up of various local anti-Hamas clans, mostly centered in central and northern Gaza. Israel's strategy was to arm and empower these groups to act as local proxies.
To do what, exactly? Maintain order.
Maintain law and order, secure aid distribution, and prevent a vacuum that Hamas could rush back into. Abu Shabab was the visible figurehead of this whole effort. He was essentially Israel's main local point of contact.
So he was strategically very important. Who was responsible for his death?
Well, the reports were immediately conflicted, which itself just highlights how volatile the situation on the ground is. Some Palestinian sources suggested it was an Israeli strike that went wrong.
An accident.
An accident, yes. Others pointed to a targeted assassination by Hamas, which of course views these collaborators as traitors. And then a third possibility was an internal dispute over resources or control.
But regardless of who did it, his death eliminates a key piece of Israel's plan.
It does. It immediately calls into question the viability of this entire strategy of relying on these splinter groups.
What are the critics saying about where this strategy goes now?
Well, its viability looks precarious, to say the least. Israeli officials have argued that empowering these clans is the only rapid way to fill that security vacuum.
At the downside.
The critics, and this includes security analysts, Palestinian political figures, international observers, they've been warning for a while that this strategy is essentially sowing the seeds of warlordism.
You arm competing clans and you get
Chaos. You get chaos.
Yeah.
The long-term result isn't a unified Palestinian authority, but a collection of highly decentralized, mutually hostile militias that could entrench perpetual instability and organized crime. And that undermines any future peace. Abu Shabab's death just accelerates that fear dramatically.
And all the while, the core diplomatic efforts are just completely stalled.
The paralysis is deep. Israeli air and artillery strikes continued in densely populated urban centers, which severely complicates the already desperate humanitarian access for aid groups.
And we saw forces tragically recover the remains of at least one Israeli hostage.
Yes, but the deep mistrust between Israel, Hamas, and the regional mediators over things like prisoner exchange ratios and long-term governance. It means that despite all this international pressure, meaningful negotiations remain completely frozen. The human suffering just continues, unabated.
So we've established these intense geopolitical pressure points. You've got peace deals driven by minerals, maximalist war goals in Ukraine, strategic vacuums in Gaza. But what's so remarkable about December 4th is how those global tensions were mirrored by these profound domestic battles over U.S. institutions themselves.
That's the crucial thematic connection. And the first example is just stunning. It's the highly symbolic politicization of peace at the United States Institute of Peace, or USIP.
USIP is supposed to be the absolute epitome of nonpartisan, high-level foreign policy work. What's its original mandate?
It was established by Congress back in 1984. It's a congressionally created, taxpayer-funded body, and its specific mandate is to conduct research, training, and programs in conflict resolution and international stability. It is designed to operate completely outside the political fray.
But it's been locked in this power struggle with the Trump administration for a year.
A year-long struggle. Earlier in 2025, the administration began this process to um, effectively seize direct control, firing the leadership and staff, transferring its headquarters building to the GSA, and moving the institute under a newly created executive control department.
And the administration chose the exact moment the world was watching D.C., the day the Washington Accords were being signed, to escalate this institutional fight dramatically.
The timing was astonishingly deliberate. On December 3rd and 4th, as this high-profile Congo-Rwanda ceremony is scheduled, the White House physically rebranded the USIP headquarters.
What did they do?
Workers came and installed new signage. And the new sign read, "The Donald J. Trump Institute of Peace." It was mounted directly above the existing USIP inscription, literally turning this nonpartisan body into a monument to the sitting president.
The optics of that are just incredible.
Spokespeople framed it as celebrating the president's foreign policy successes, but critics, of course, saw it as institutional vandalism.
So what is the actual legal status of this building and its name right now? It sounds like an administrative nightmare.
It is in complete legal limbo. Before the rebranding, a federal district judge had actually ruled that the administration's takeover, the transfer of the building, the firing of the staff, was unlawful.
On what grounds?
The judge argued it violated the statutory independence of the institute. But that ruling was immediately stayed or temporarily halted, pending appeal to a higher court.
So you have a building with a new, highly political name on it.
While the official USIP website, the remaining staff, and the legal structure all still adhere to the original independent identity. Lawyers for the ousted leadership called the rebranding a deep insult to injury, arguing it severely politicizes a body that is meant to be a neutral arbiter of peace.
This aggressive move against a historically independent institution has to have massive implications. What does the outcome of this court battle really mean for the broader structure of the executive branch?
Well, this USIP episode is a textbook case of a much broader pattern. It's about the executive branch asserting direct control over these independent, semi-autonomous bodies that Congress designed to provide checks and nonpartisan expertise.
And if the courts ultimately side with the administration?
If they do, it will significantly expand the legal boundaries around how far a president can go in unilaterally dismantling or reshaping these congressionally mandated arms of the foreign policy apparatus. The outcome will really shape whether these institutions can maintain the nonpartisan credibility that is so fundamentally necessary for their global influence.
Especially when you're trying to broker complex deals like the one with Congo and Rwanda, you need that credibility.
You absolutely need it.
Okay, moving from institutional seizure to judicial intervention, let's talk about the high-stakes Supreme Court ruling on Texas voting maps.
The Supreme Court issued a major emergency order that day, and it allowed Texas to immediately use a Republican-drawn congressional map that had previously been blocked by a lower federal court.
And that lower court had blocked it because...
Because it ruled the map likely violated minority voting protections, specifically under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
For listeners who might not be familiar, how does a map like this actually dilute minority voting power? What are the mechanics of it?
Well, these maps employed gerrymandering techniques known as packing and cracking.
Packing and cracking.
In Texas, the map was accused of packing high concentrations of minority voters, Black and Hispanic communities, into fewer districts than their population would warrant. It essentially wastes their votes by making those districts overwhelmingly non-competitive.
And cracking.
Conversely, it might crack other minority communities, splitting them up across multiple districts so their voting power is diluted and they can't elect a candidate of their choice in any of them.
So what's the practical, immediate effect of the Supreme Court's order?
The emergency order means that this disputed map is now immediately in force for the upcoming election cycle. That's the key.
Even while the legal case is still ongoing.
Exactly. Even while the case proceeds slowly through the appellate process. This gives Republicans a structural advantage in potentially securing several closely contested seats, regardless of the final legal outcome.
And voting rights advocates must see this as a huge blow.
They condemn the move. They view it as another step in the continuous weakening of federal oversight over state election rules, a trend we've seen accelerating ever since the court started chipping away at the Voting Rights Act a decade ago. It also sends a clear signal to other states that might be considering similar partisan maps.
This theme of accountability and oversight also came up in two separate incidents involving the U.S. military and Pentagon leadership.
Yes, We saw these simultaneous friction points that really exposed the tensions between political leaders and military professionals. The first involved a deadly strike in the Eastern Pacific.
On a suspected drug smuggling boat.
Right, where 4 men were killed. And reports had surfaced suggesting a senior Navy commander might have issued an unlawful order to kill them all.
So what was the Admiral's defense during his testimony on Capitol Hill?
He vehemently insisted there was no literal kill-them-all order issued. He characterized that alleged quote as a misinterpretation, or maybe an offhand, non-literal comment that was taken wildly out of context during a high-pressure operation.
But he still defended the strike itself.
He defended the strike as compliant with the laws of armed conflict and the rules of engagement. But he did concede that video footage of the event was deeply troubling, which underscores just how complex and severe maintaining oversight is in these lethal high-speed operations.
And then completely separately, you have this issue with the civilian defense secretary and how he handled sensitive communications.
Yeah, exactly. A detailed Pentagon review concluded that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had violated established military communication rules.
Wow.
He was found to have shared details of a U.S. strike in Yemen in an encrypted Signal group chat. It's a private messaging app.
Not an official channel.
Not an official channel. The review did exonerate him regarding using encrypted apps during a related incident, a September double-tap mission, but it still faulted him for breaching security protocols by using a private channel for sensitive operational details.
What's a double tap mission, and why is the communication method so sensitive here?
A double tap in a counterterrorism context usually refers to a second strike launched shortly after the first, often targeting first responders or others who arrive on the scene. They're very controversial under international law.
And the communication?
The issue isn't the app's encryption itself. It's the lack of official record keeping. Using a private, encrypted chat for operational details undermines Congress's ability to conduct oversight, it complicates legal and historical records, and it significantly increases the risk of leaks or security breaches of highly classified information.
So these two seemingly separate incidents, one about a lethal order, the other about a signal chat, they really expose the same underlying tension.
They do. They expose friction between Congress demanding accountability, uniformed commanders asserting operational necessity, and political leaders sometimes bypassing standard procedure. Critics argue that this combination of opaque targeting procedures and a willingness of high-ranking leaders to mishandle secure information. It risks eroding public trust and setting a dangerous precedent.
A crisis of command and transparency.
All at once, yes.
Let's turn now to immigration and the deeply concerning effect that aggressive enforcement and political rhetoric was having, particularly within Somali American communities.
This day was marked by this convergence of aggressive action and highly inflammatory language. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, launched a mass arrest campaign.
Where?
Specifically targeting the Minneapolis-St. Paul region, which is home to one of the nation's largest Somali populations, and also New Orleans. Agents were rounding up migrants accused of visa fraud and overstaying protections. The administration framed it as a necessary surge.
And the political rhetoric that went along with this enforcement was extremely harsh.
It was. The Associated Press highlighted a string of remarks and social media posts from the president where he referred to Somali neighborhoods as garbage and openly suggested that some refugees don't belong in America. This kind of language moves far beyond a critique of immigration policy and into, well, explicit ethnic-based stigmatization.
The sources outline something called a safety paradox that results from this. Can you explain that dynamic?
Community leaders and advocacy groups warn that when you combine the aggressive raids with the president's rhetoric, it fuels intense fear, marginalization, and alienation, especially among young people who feel like they're not wanted in their own country.
And the paradox is?
The paradox is that counterterrorism experts have warned for years that this exact dynamic ironically makes communities less safe.
How so?
When communities fear or distrust authorities because of aggressive enforcement and discriminatory language, they stop cooperating. They stop reporting crimes. They stop sharing vital intelligence. The resulting alienation erodes trust and ultimately creates greater security risks for everyone. It turns immigration policy into a dangerous social wedge.
And finally, within this domestic focus, we have the external issue of the Honduras election and concerns over U.S. favoritism.
Honduras is critical to U.S. domestic interests. It's a major source of migrants traveling north and a key corridor for drug trafficking. And the 2025 presidential race was a crucial test of stability.
It was between who?
Between the anti-corruption crusader Salvador Nasrallah and the conservative Nasri Asfura, who is aligned with the National Party and had received a prior endorsement from the U.S. president.
And the vote count was incredibly volatile. What happened on December 4th?
The race was on a knife edge. With over 80% of the vote counted, it seesawed multiple times. Initially, it looked like Nasrallah had a lead, but then Asfara pulled narrowly ahead, getting just over 40% to Nasrallah's 39.5%.
And that shift immediately prompted accusations of fraud.
Immediately, accusations of foul play, manipulation. Nasrallah's camp was furious.
And the U.S. president weighed in right away, complicating an already tense situation.
He did. President Trump took to a social media platform to congratulate Asfara on the victory and claimed, without providing any evidence, that his ally was being robbed by fraud.
And regional observers are worried this could undermine the whole outcome.
Deeply worried. This kind of overt U.S. presidential favoritism risks fatally undermining the credibility of the entire election. If Nasrallah mounts a legal challenge or calls supporters to the streets, the U.S. endorsement of Asfara could be seen by the opposition as proof of international meddling. It could deepen the crisis rather than resolve it. Hashtag 3. Economic, environmental, and technological fault lines.
Okay, let's shift our focus now to the massive structural changes shaping the global economy, the environment, and technology. These are the slow-moving tectonic plates under all the political volatility we've been discussing.
Right.
And let's start with the accelerating, really fundamental shift in U.S.-China trade relations.
This represents a major policy pivot that was really formalized that day by the U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer. He stated unequivocally that U.S. trade with China needs to be more balanced and, quote, probably needs to be smaller.
Probably needs to be smaller. That's fascinating. It's not just about correcting the trade deficit. It's about managed contraction.
Exactly. And he didn't just state a preference. He cited data, noting that the roughly 25% drop in goods trade that had already happened was the right direction.
So what's the explicit goal driving the strategy of making trade smaller?
The administration is pursuing a strategy known as de-risking, which, in practice, looks a lot like focused decoupling.
So it's about reducing dependence on Chinese supply chains.
Precisely. Especially for advanced or strategic goods, this involves aggressively boosting domestic production or friend-shoring production to allies of things like critical minerals and advanced technologies.
Which connects right back to the Congo Accords we started with.
It's all part of a coordinated effort to secure raw materials outside of China's sphere of influence. Greer insisted they were trying to avoid an all-out economic conflict, but only by steering trade strictly into non-sensitive goods, with the U.S. defining what sensitive means.
What are the global implications of Washington committing to this long-term contraction strategy? It must put allies in a tough spot.
It signals to the world that this shift is permanent and structural. For U.S. allies in Asia and Europe, it underscores a huge dilemma. They have to maintain their crucial security ties with Washington, but at the same time, they need access to China's massive consumer markets and manufacturing capacity.
They're caught in the middle.
Completely. And Washington is pushing for deeper coordination on things like export controls and tech restrictions, forcing allies to make increasingly hard economic choices that favor geopolitical alignment over immediate commercial benefit. The world economy is fundamentally fragmenting along these strategic lines.
No, we have to confront the climate reality check, which was delivered in some devastating forms on December 4th. Before we even get to policy, the sheer scale of the immediate catastrophe is staggering.
Absolutely. The human tragedy in Asia was just awful. Through late November and early December, you had these extreme prolonged monsoon rains that triggered catastrophic floods and landslides across huge swaths of South and Southeast Asia.
Indonesia, Bangladesh,
India, the Philippines. The regional death toll tragically climbed past 1,500 people. Hundreds of thousands were displaced, and critical infrastructure, roads, bridges, power plants, was severely damaged.
And the economic cost must have been massive.
New estimates put the losses across Asia at well over $20 billion.
And what are scientists saying?
What they stress is vital to understand is that these are not isolated freak events. This is part of a clear, intensifying pattern of extreme rainfall that's directly linked to human-driven climate change.
Warmer oceans mean more moisture in the storm.
Exactly. Warmer oceans load significantly more moisture into storms, causing them to dump historically unprecedented amounts of water over land. This is the new reality vulnerable countries are facing, and they're citing these specific events to demand far more ambitious global emission cuts.
But immediately following this catastrophe, we saw massive policy contradictions coming from the U.S. administration that seemed to be moving in the exact opposite direction.
The domestic policy rollbacks were severe. The Trump administration announced it would reverse key vehicle fuel efficiency standards, the CAFE standards that were put in place under the previous administration.
And what does that do, practically?
They are effectively gutting the federal efforts designed to promote the adoption of electric vehicles, or EVs. They're returning gasoline and internal combustion engines to the explicit center of U.S. transport policy.
The environmental cost of that reversal has to be huge.
Environmental groups warned this move will significantly increase future U.S. carbon emissions, directly undermining the country's already shaky international climate commitments. It's a direct prioritization of short-term economic factors and specific industries over long-term environmental sustainability.
And meanwhile, the global climate deal, COP30 in Brazil, offered only incremental progress.
Analysts from highly vulnerable nations describe the outcome of COP30 with this mix of hope and letdown.
Hope and letdowns.
They achieved some incremental successes. They boosted finance for climate adaptation, helping countries cope with the impacts that are already here, like these deadly floods.
But the big piece was missing.
The big piece was missing. The deal notably avoided any direct binding commitment to phase out fossil fuels. And that failure means vulnerable countries fear the world remains firmly on track to overshoot the critical 1.5 degrees C warming goal, which would make events like the Asian floods the standard, not the exception.
And adding to all this complexity and doubt, we also saw a major scientific setback that day.
Yes, a prominent climate study that had gained widespread traction. It was being used by central banks and financial regulators to model climate-related financial risks.
Like mortgage risk in flood-prone areas.
Exactly that kind of thing. Well, it was retracted due to significant methodological errors. And this immediately sparked an intense debate over the robustness and reliability of climate risk analytics. It gave critics of aggressive climate regulation an opening to question the entire foundation of these models.
So we have these massive policy failures, scientific uncertainty, and yet the sources also included one major, clear environmental success story.
This is the important counterpoint, the paradox of human cooperation. News broke that the Antarctic ozone hole ranked among the smallest recorded since the early 1990s.
And that's because of the Montreal Protocol.
It is held up by atmospheric scientists as clear, powerful evidence that sustained internationally coordinated environmental policies. Specifically, the Montreal Protocol, which targeted ozone-depleting substances, can actually work to reverse damage to planetary systems. It's a model for what climate action could achieve. It offers a little glimpse of hope amid all the other dismal news.
Finally, let's explore the critical fault lines in U.S. health, labor, and technology, starting with the labor market. Despite overall reports of economic growth, the human cost of restructuring was intense.
The statistics are grim. They speak to this pervasive anxiety among workers. Cumulative U.S. layoffs in 2025 pushed past 1.1 million. That's 11,170,821 through November.
Which is the highest since 2020.
The highest since the pandemic year. And this restructuring isn't confined to just one sector. Industries hit particularly hard included technology, which saw over 150,000 cuts, and telecoms, where Verizon announced 15,000 layoffs in November alone. It's intense labor churn, suggesting corporate profitability is being achieved through significant workforce streamlining.
Which translates directly into insecurity for millions of families.
Exactly.
We also saw the politicization of public health hitting a critical point, specifically around routine childhood vaccinations.
This involves the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. This committee, which now includes members favored by the administration, unexpectedly delayed a scheduled vote.
A vote on what?
The vote was intended to either reaffirm or modify the standard recommendations for giving the hepatitis B shot to newborns. And the delay followed this wave of public comments from high-level administration figures who are questioning the necessity of the birth dose for infants born to low-risk mothers.
What's the public health rationale for giving that shot universally at birth, and what's the danger in questioning it?
The rationale is simple. Hepatitis B often spreads silently. Mothers can be unaware they carry the virus. And early protection is vital because infants who get infected are at extremely high risk of developing chronic, lifelong infection that can lead to liver failure or cancer.
So the danger is?
The danger, public health experts warn, is that politicizing any routine childhood vaccine recommendation, even by just suggesting a delay for a small subgroup, risks eroding overall public trust in the entire vaccine schedule. and that can lead to lower coverage rates and outbreaks of entirely preventable diseases.
And this specific incident really connects to broader systemic problems in U.S. healthcare.
It absolutely does. An analysis published that day argued that U.S. healthcare is, in aggregate, getting worse on several critical fronts.
What were the main drivers?
The two main drivers cited were persistently rising out-of-pocket costs for patients and unchecked market consolidation among both insurers and hospital systems. This concentration of power allows large entities to demand higher prices, which increases the financial burden on patients, who then often delay or just forego necessary care. The CDC vote is a symptom of a system struggling with cost, access, and trust.
Okay, moving to the tech sphere. The day finally saw the highly anticipated ruling in the federal antitrust case against Google.
This was a landmark judgment. A federal judge ruled decisively that Google's search business constitutes an illegal monopoly. The judge agreed with the Department of Justice that its tactics were anti-competitive.
But the judge rejected the government's most drastic proposed remedy.
Right. The judge delivered a twist by rejecting a structural breakup, like forcing Google to sell off its Chrome browser or its advertising units.
So if there's no breakup, what was the remedy ordered to fix this illegal monopoly?
The judge instead ordered comprehensive behavioral remedies. So instead of physically dismantling the company, behavioral remedies require the company to fundamentally change how it operates.
What does that mean for Google?
The key orders included requiring Google to share specific search-related data with competitors, which reduces its data advantage. And it forces the company to loosen or renegotiate those highly lucrative default search agreements that make sure Google is the preset option on almost every device.
The goal is to lower the barrier for rival search engines.
Exactly, without the massive economic disruption of dismantling a global platform. It's less dramatic than a breakup, but the changes will be felt across the entire tech ecosystem.
And finally, a quick look at how public service journalism is trying to adapt to this tech-dominated, subscription-heavy world.
The BBC, a global leader in public service journalism, announced a major strategic test. It's launching a paid subscription tier for its most frequent U.S. readers, priced at $49.99 a year.
So this is an experiment to see if they can diversify their revenue.
It is a crucial experiment in international markets. It comes at a critical time because the BBC's long-standing funding model, that compulsory UK license fee, is under severe political review and faces a very uncertain future. This pilot really highlights the global search for sustainable funding models for independent news in a world dominated by giants like Google. Hashtag tag outro.
So stepping back from this massive deep dive, we return to that central tension of December 4th, 2025. You have this simultaneous aggressive pursuit of strategic alignments around the globe.
Securing critical minerals in Congo, contracting trade with China, the hardline approach to the war in Ukraine.
Right, but all of that is happening while the U.S. system itself is under this intense internal pressure. The USIP takeover, the SCOTUS map ruling, the CDC controversy.
That's the core synthesis. What we witnessed was a shift toward prioritizing immediate, tangible economic gain and strategic competition mineral access, de-risking energy policy rollbacks.
Often at the direct expense of what?
Of long-term institutional stability, environmental commitment, and democratic norms. The crisis isn't just about external threats. It's an internal erosion of the very structures that grant the U.S. its global credibility.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? What's the defining paradox we should take away from this day?
I think it raises a profound question about the paradox of power. We see these aggressive U.S. efforts to secure resources and enforce stability abroad, brokering the Congo Accords, dictating trade strategy, maneuvering in the Middle East.
Yet at the same time.
Yet simultaneously, there is this internal pressure and questioning directed at the very U.S. institutions, USIP, the CDC, the Supreme Court, military oversight, whose nonpartisan credibility and stability are absolutely essential for maintaining that global influence and enforcing peace in the first place.
So is the U.S. prioritizing immediate global dominance and resource advantage at the expense of its own internal stability and institutional integrity? That is the provocative thought we will leave you with today. Thank you for joining the Deep Dive.